The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. H.P. Lovecraft. Of course, Bloodborne is not a modern horror game. It isn't Silent Hill or PT. It isn't Resident Evil Amnesia, Outlast, or even some kind of game like Five Nights at Freddy's. But there is no denying that it can instill horror. The use of H.P. Lovecraft, renowned cosmic horror author, as a source was genius, and the game uses his work and influence to provide one of the most unique experiences I have ever had while playing a game. This does happen to be my personal favorite game of all time, but that's a list for another day. A lot of people like to point out the amygdala in the cathedral ward as a point in which they felt terror, as in discovering something was watching you the whole time. But I also want to point out the nightmare realms which house the grotesque beings such as the mother brain, a Shaggoth, a weird contorted brain with eyes all over its body, end quote. The silver beasts and the clockwork guys in the Nightmare of Menses. Bloodborne does not rely on jump scares. Sometimes things jump out from the dark if you're not careful, like the one scourge beast before the blood-starved beast boss fight, or the beastmen in Old Yharnam, or even the snakehead dudes in the Forbidden Woods. Instead, Bloodborne relies on psychological horror. But then, is it fair to call Bloodborne a horror game? Since technically it is an action RPG. Action JRPG to be precise. So to make it quick, does Bloodborne's use of horror or terror prove to be effective enough to categorize it in the horror genre? In my opinion, it's 100% a horror game. It's just not modern horror. It's more on the lines of traditional horror. The difference is entirely in how it induces fear. Modern horror is about building tension before a release, raise people's expectations that something bad will happen, make them fear what is coming next, and then release it onto them. Usually in the form of a jump scare like in Five Nights at Freddy's, or something more subdued but equally as shocking like in Bioshock with the splicers. While Bloodborne sometimes has moments like that, it never intentionally builds tension to those points. They usually come from a player failing to check their surroundings or something of the sort. It's not the game doing it to set the tone, it's a punishment for running into the middle of a room without checking the corners. However, Bloodborne is a perfect example of traditional horror. If you read some old horror stories, you'll get a good idea of what traditional horror is. It's less about building tension and immediately scaring people, and it's more about a constant feeling of anxiety. Some writers I could list are Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, and of course the man of the hour, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Though Bram Stoker's Dracula is a fantastic example of traditional horror in film, there's no real jump scares or anything of that sort. But there's something off the whole time. It never feels right, and even once it's made clear why. Well, spoilers, Dracula's a vampire. But the feeling of dread doesn't go away because the explanation is something horrible. Vampirism is dealt with in the game with reference and appearances of the Cainhurst Wild-Bloods, who I assume survived on the blood of the beasts or men slain by the Cainhurst hunters in the honor of their queen, Queen Annalise. Furthermore, in Lovecraft's short story titled The Shadow over Innsmouth, the mention of the Deep One signifies its usage within the game as a great deep one, Cos, or some say Cosm, makes an appearance, and we fight her orphaned child, a cosmic entity, the last remnant since the daughter of the cosmos, Ebrietas. Bloodborne works extremely well under that genre. It's very much about feeling like everything is out of your control. A point I like to bring up is progression. Progression in the first half of Bloodborne is extremely and massively linear. You go from point A to point B without a lot of extra paths. During this period of time, nothing has been explained, you're finding things out, and you're unfamiliar with the game. The game builds that anxiety through those means. You don't know what is happening, and every time you think you've got a grip, it throws a boss at you that tests you in a way the previous boss outright did not. However, once you hit the midway point in the game, that stops entirely. The game gets several completely optional areas, and progression basically becomes you doing what you want to do. This coincides with the entire nature of the world changing. Everything you thought you knew was wrong, and here's why. And guess what? Everything is basically a cosmic game of chess, and you have no idea what your part in it is. So, not only is that wonderfully contradicting, but also the game basically stops telling you how to progress once you beat Rom the vacuous spider. And though that's a pretty straightforward path, you've also suddenly got a lot more options and a vague goal. This explains that you're being used and nothing is actually your own choice alone. It also emphasizes that feeling of dread just as you start to get over it. And then on top of that, the existential horror, which is part of traditional horror as a genre. This is pretty consistent through and through as well. The idea of becoming a beast is pretty horrifying. The idea of becoming a celestial being is somewhat worse. Then there's the use of insanity as a game mechanic, frenzy as it's known, and all the talk of reality and how we view it in various ways depending on the insight we've gained in our endeavors. The background music is brilliant too, in which case there is none. It sets the melancholic tones through atmosphere and location alone. And if there is an instance of music, then it's only in the boss battles that usually involve haunting scores and provide a sense of dread with its church organ music. And I don't mean that in a bad way, it's just very, very creepy. And this is where the game shows its true colors as a towering achievement in video games. It psychologically manipulates the player into playing it a certain way by inducing fear through subtle atmospheric hints, level design, and whatever little music it can provide in the most seamlessly executed moments. Bloodborne is not modern horror, but it's a shining, brilliant example of traditional horror. I have the utmost respect for the team at From Software that worked on Bloodborne, including the director Hidetaka Miyazaki and composer Yuka Kitamura. Their genius, in my opinion, is unparalleled.